Hello and welcome to this afternoon's Strategic Dairy Farm webinar on making the most of your buildings at calving. I'm Emily Collins, Knowledge Exchange Manager at AHDB Dairy, and I'm very grateful to be joined by Tim Downs, Ian Ohnstad and Nathan Loewenstein. So I'll just start off with a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone will be muted and please do ask questions throughout the webinar, so you should be able to open up the side panel and type it in. All questions are anonymous, so do ask away. For Dairy Pro points, please do provide your name, email and postcode and we'll get those to you. And we should be finished by 1:15. So just to introduce, we will be covering today just reviewing Tim's calving period and then looking at the close to calving facilities that he has, touching on the general housing principles and the opportunities that he's got to improve, and then assessing where is best to invest, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, as we call it. So we'll start by just saying thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And Tim, how have things been going really since last meeting was in November, and maybe a little bit of an introduction on the farm for people that don't know you.
Oh, welcome everyone to the farm at Longnor. Not quite as we had in mind. We thought we might be able to do some on-farm meetings and show you what we've been up to recently. Certainly after a very wet winter, now we've gone back to what we got used to last year with a very dry spring, which is fantastic for ground conditions, not overly brilliant for grass growth, but we are virtually through calving now. So out of the block, we're down to the last 15 to calve. Things have gone reasonably smoothly with calving, very few assists, and we're now in the process of trying to get the replacements growing and looking at making some changes to the calving yard and constantly improving things as well. So hence why Nathan and Ian have both been giving of their ideas and focus. So we look forward to a good discussion today. Sadly not on farm though.
Yeah, sadly still not on farm. So we've got Nathan today, who is Tim's farm vet from Shropshire Vets. So thanks, Nathan. So do you want to, Tim, maybe say how many you've been calving recently, and then we'll go into some figures with Nathan.
So we began calving on the 15th of February. We're spring block calving. We're on a contract with OMSCO, Organic Milk Suppliers Cooperative, for the American premium market. So we therefore have to be very careful about trying to minimize any antibiotic usage, both within calving time, which is generally the more stressful time for the pregnant cow, and also early lactation as well. So trying to get things as low stress as possible, avoiding problems in the calving yards. Choice of bull, choice of dam to start with is probably one of the most important areas. Nutrition, getting that right, feeding space, which we'll cover in an awful lot more detail today. But all straw yarded as well. We're milking through direct to line Waikato 24-48 parlour. We segregate milk and feed whole milk to calves as well, and we've been constantly trying to improve our Johne's management as well, which has been pretty good in the past, but we're trying to improve all the time and separate heifers so they calve in a separate area from cows, which I'm sure we'll cover the importance with Nathan going through the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just bring Nathan in. And Nathan, do you want to introduce how you've been working with Tim and the preparation you do before calving, and then looking at these figures in front of us now?
Sure, absolutely. Just before we do it, can I just pop back to the slide before that? Sorry.
Of course, sorry.
Because at the bottom there, I mean, for all block calving herds, it's obviously important, but potentially being an organic herd Tim and his team have worked really hard to make sure that their calving block is as front loaded as possible, as you can see from the 6-week in calf rates and the empty rates. And that's obviously important for a number of reasons, and we've worked really hard on that. There's a lot of work that's gone in both in the calving period and setting up that block, because obviously that's going to encourage cows to produce more milk, have more time to get ready to get back in calf. Heifers, when they're going to be served, are going to be older, and obviously we're also, if you're front loading your calving block, you're going to have less bugs available to kind of the younger calves and the cows calving later on. So that's going to minimize your calf disease and your cow disease, and therefore hopefully reduce the amount of antibiotics that you might ever need to use. So if we go back to those results now, please. So yeah, so the team have put a lot of hard work in, as I said, both setting up the block and also in the calving period. And as you can see here, these results are all pretty good. I mean, these are the figures these are the kind of the parameters that we look at during the transition period and during the calving period, trying to keep these within targets. I mean, as you can see here, these targets are all very, very good. I mean, I suppose you can look at the assisted calvings, they're within target. The heifers are slightly overrepresented in there, which isn't surprising really. I mean, heifers often are, but yeah, we're sort of below that 5%. And when we're looking at disease in cows in and around the calving period, all mammals, when they approach giving birth, their immune system drops. That's a normal physiological act, and that happens for all mammals. And so that's why we have to kind of concentrate really carefully here. So if we look at things like uterine disease, Tim's and his team, they're looking at cows in blocks of cows as they go through the block from around about 21 days. So we're not waiting till the end of the block to check all cows for being dirty. They're checking them periodically every couple of weeks as cows come through. And we can see here that kind of our mastitis scores and our whites scores are all pretty low. And those two scores, uterine disease is kind of really heavily impacted on by retained fetal membranes, twins, stillbirths, twins, and assisted calvings in that order. And you can see here, all those figures are low, which is why it's reflecting in having low rates of mastitis and whites. And overall, having a good kind of periparturient period for the cows is kind of determined by making sure that the cows go through the transition period into the fresh period as well as possible. And so, as you'll see when we look at the buildings, lots of clean straw, cows maximizing their dry matter intake and limiting movements, and all those things have massive impacts on things like ketosis, DAs, and all the other things that we're looking at here. So kind of the management of the housing is really impacted really heavily on these, as we'll see as we go a bit further on. Right.
There certainly is pressure within the system, though, at certain times when we're feeding dry cows on self-feed silage, on easy feed barriers, and we just try and minimize that as much as we possibly can by keeping groups in manageable numbers. Yards change constantly as we're drying cows off, and as we're calving cows, we're constantly having to change group numbers pretty quickly when we're calving 10 to 15 a day during early March. So yeah, trying to minimize the disruption as much as we possibly can, and stress.
That's great. And do you think, have your figures always been this good, Tim, or have you kind of come on a journey?
Yeah, looking back, assisted calvings, we've never had to assist a huge amount. Twins probably have been a bit higher in the past, but I'm not sure why they've started to reduce a bit. I know some farmers do have an awful lot of twins. We tend to find those are quite problematic to then get back in calve, and there's more pressure on them. We weigh every single calve at birth, so I've got an interesting statistic. The first 122 calves were 37.7 kilos. The majority of those would have been replacement sex semen calves. And then the following Angus, we haven't actually worked out the total weights, but they feel much closer to 40 kilos over the weigh scales as they go into the pens. Retained fetal membrane, we're very careful as we calve to use clean gloves, both arms, clean Lubrel. making sure all the ropes are soaped, and things we've learnt from vets over the years, trying to minimise intervention unless we possibly have to, and that probably follows through the metritis and the whites. Milk fever, we're using minerals through the water system, so that has certainly helped reduce any deficiencies, any calcium problems at point of calving. Any older cows we're giving a bolus to at that time, which really helps with their immune system at calving, and I think then avoids some of the mastitis problems we've had historically. Ketosis and displaced abomasums, we've been harvesting with a self-loading forage wagon, which has quite long chopped silage, so that certainly helps the rumen. They're getting plenty of organic straw as well. Mixed in with some whole crop this year, whole crop oats, which has quite a bit of scratch and fibre in it as well, and some seaweed minerals as they're in the calving yard. But the calving yard is quite a quick throughput, so very often they can only be in there for a matter of a week before they're calved and into the milking system.
Thank you, good insight. I'm sure we'll touch on some more of these going on. So we'll bring in Ian now. Thank you. I guess, well, I think between Ian and Tim, are you going to talk us through the calving yard and the process of close to calving and moving them into that?
Okay, thanks, Emily. So I just wanted to set the scene as much as anything. So the image that you can see in front of you, circled in red, is actually Tim's close to calving yard and the calving yard. So this really is the area that we want to focus on today, really looking at animals in the last 2 to 3 weeks pre-calving. So on the next slide, we can see the inside of the shed. It's basically a central passage with 2 straw yards on either side. You can see there's a hard standing for the cows to feed from. Then there's a bedded yard, which Tim keeps well bedded up with good quality straw. The top left of this particular image, which has just disappeared, is the thanks, Emily. It is an access out to pasture, so the cows can access some grazing through that top left. And then the next slide is showing that's the other side of the passage, the feed passage. So again, very similar layout, straw yards with a hard stand for the cows to feed from when they're not lying down. And there is, you can see at the top left of that image, there is a gate leaning on the wall there. So one of the things that I'll ask Tim to speak about in a moment is basically the flexibility within the yards, by able to pen off certain areas depending on the needs and the requirements as the calving progresses. So the cows are actually fed with a very simple diagonal feed barrier. So the feed is presented there. It's wide enough to get a machine up through, but actually the feed face per se it's not limiting, but it's certainly not excessive in terms of the availability for each animal. And then in the final sort of internal slide, we can see there's a small area of separate pen. Which, would you just like to explain how you use that pen area there, Tim?
So those have been nicknamed the pamper pens, Ian, and listeners, those are where we have cameras throughout the calving yard, and we'll put cows and newborn calves in an individual pen as far as we possibly can. There's room for 3 cows and 3 calves in there, and there was just the other side of the stone wall as well. There's room for 4 cows and their calves in an individual pen. So they're put in there, they're given immediate new silage and minerals, and then we milk the cow out, take the colostrum off, put it in a 4 litre feeder, feed back to the calf to make doubly sure that we're getting the most important immunoglobulins and benefit from the colostrum. Any surplus colostrum we'll store, we'll mark up, we'll write the cow, we'll measure the refractometer scale on it, aiming for above 22, and we'll store that with the date, the cow, and whether it's good enough for replacement calves in the future. And they'll stay in there for until the next 24 hours. They'll be in there, maybe quicker if we're getting a big influx, because we can't quite fit enough cows and calves in pens, hence the gates on the wall are for expansion area. So yeah, it works, but it is tight and needs constant watching and ability to put them in individual pens so that the calves stay clean. We'll dip their navels in strong iodine as they go in, and record down the time of birth and the sex and the cow that's given birth. And if we're getting a lot of very similar calves born, we'll put collars on as well, with just an inch wide piece of sprung elastic, different colors, so we know which calf is which, so we don't confuse them for the BVD tag and testing. That covers the majority of what we do, Ian.
Thanks, Tim. I think, I mean, it highlights the specific challenges that we face with a tight block calving herd, and of course a tight block, as Nathan alluded to earlier, we want a lot of cows calving in the first 6-week period. If we're particularly good at our fertility management and we achieve those targets, 9 months later we of course have a lot of cows producing calves in a very short space of time. So the layouts that we have does give you that flexibility. Also slightly compounded by your wish, where possible, to keep cow and calf together for 24 hours. So obviously when you're calving a dozen or 15 cows a day, having that flexibility with the individual gates to move and create small pens gives you some flexibility. So the actual, you've seen some images. The next slide is just a very rough sketch of the layout. So the straw bedded areas left and right hand side, hard feed stands to allow the cows to feed off, and then the central area is just the double-sided feed barrier. So when we actually then start to look a little bit about at the actual facilities on the next slide, the way that it's run is that Tim will keep heifers and cows separate on each side of the feed passage. So heifers on one side and cows on the other side. Now that's predominantly for Johne's control, and Nathan's going to talk a little bit about why that's critical for all herds, and how we get that flexibility with Tim's herd. Now, Tim, you were saying a maximum of 20 animals per side?
Yes, definite maximum. Any more than that and it gets too hard to keep clean enough for my wife Louise's demands, to make sure that we've got the animals clean, because we don't want mucky cows.
And the cows are bedded, the straw's applied every day.
Yes.
So, and then moving them across from the, as Tim said earlier, the dry cow accommodation elsewhere on the farm, which is also straw yards, in an ideal world coming across there in the last 3 weeks of the pregnancy. So we are by definition going to have fairly significant peaks of numbers of cows coming over, which is why this sort of dynamic movement of cows is absolutely essential.
We're moving them every day, we are, Ian.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is an interesting concept in itself, because of the disruption to the herd and the sort of the social hierarchy within the group when you're moving. But when you're turning these cows over so quickly, there's no option. As I said earlier, I think we have this perfect storm really of somewhere between a dozen and 15 cows calving a day at peak times, and then Tim's requirement to keep cows and calves together for 24 hours. So it does create certain pinch points during the year or during the calving season. So we then start to look at some of the requirements that we need for any pre-calving yard and calving yard. And the types of areas that we get very interested in is obviously stocking rates. So the numbers of cows that we would have in a yard at any one time. So we can have ideal numbers, but of course it's also possible to make fairly accurate forecasts, knowing when cows are PD'd. So you can see the problem looming. Doesn't necessarily mean you have a solution for it, but you know when the problem is just around the corner, because you know when your peak weeks are going to be with cows calving. Nathan's going to talk about feeding, because clearly we want to make sure that we've got good access to high value forage during that last 2 to 3 weeks of the pregnancy. But some of the actual physical requirements, not least particularly with straw yards, is ventilation. And we are going to talk a little bit about the requirements for ventilation and the principles, but also what can be done to try and improve ventilation within a facility. And then we'll touch on the actual physical management of the yards at and around calving, and clearly hygiene, which is critical. So if we look at stocking rates and stocking density, there's a very practical and helpful figure, which is you require about 1¼ square meters of straw bedded area for every 1,000 litres of production. So clearly a cow that's doing 12,000 litres is going to require a greater straw bedded area than a cow doing 6,500 litres. So in Tim's case, with his 6,500 litre cows, we're looking just over 8 square meters per cow. But of course, bear in mind that is purely bedded area. That's the straw yard, that's nothing more. So on top of the bedded area, we need a loafing area. And ideally, we're looking for somewhere in the region of 3 square meters per cow. So if we actually look in the entirety, then we're looking over 11 square meters per cow of total building area. So over 8 meters for bedding and over 3 meters for loafing. So if we work out with Tim's shed, that's a maximum of 23 cows per side, assuming that all the yard is available. And Tim very categorically stated that he never has more than 20 cows in there. So on paper, we're flying, we're cooking on gas, because we can have 23 cows and Tim never puts more than 20 in. But of course, that does make the assumption that every square meter of bedding is the same. So if we look at the next slide, what we have is an interesting situation where if you have any drinking facility on a bedded yard, with the best will in the world, cows, when they drink, will splash. They tend to stamp and move around a lot while they're drinking. So we can lose some available bedded area because it becomes poached. Now, Tim, I think you've got 1 trough left. You've moved the rest of your troughs off the yard.
Yes, yeah, we changed a few years ago to stainless steel easy empty troughs next to the feed barrier, and that's been a huge improvement. We can keep water very palatable, very clean, but there is one that's surrounded by the blue boards in that upper photograph, and that allows us to put the heifers with their calves in there. Heifers are a little bit more notorious and need a bit more management. Some accept their calves no problem at all and want everybody else's calves. Others do take a dislike to anything that runs at them looking to go for an udder. We have to just separate those cows or heifers and their calves from others. So yeah, it becomes a gating challenge, to say the least.
And how much bedded area do you think around the trough do you lose, Tim?
Or it would be probably 4 meters square, I should think, around the trough that tends to be lower lying. The cows don't tend to want to lie there as much, but we keep the other area exceptionally well bedded. It is a priority all the way through calving. It's bedded once a day, scraped and mucked out once a day as well. So that's worked very well this year. We've got a really good team, which they see the priorities the same as we do in making sure that it's clean and well organised and well run.
So in a perfect world, if it was at all possible, we would have no water troughs on straw yards, so that they're always drinking from a hard standing. which A, means we don't lose any of our valuable square meters, but also means that you're more comfortable or confident about cleaning troughs out without making a mess. The other area that is also highly relevant, if you look at the second slide at the top left corner, I mentioned earlier that that's the gateway out to the pasture. Any area of traffic and cow traffic, whether it's frequent or infrequent, the first thing that will happen is that we will again lose some of our valuable square meters because it becomes fairly cut up fairly quickly. The other thing is that cows tend not to want to settle in an area where there's movement of cows constantly in amongst them. So I'm guessing, Tim, when the shed is fairly full and the cows have access to grazing, you'll probably not find too many cows sitting or lying directly in the gateway.
No, we tend to allow them out during the daytime as it's transitioning through later spring. We'll allow them to go out and graze during the day and come back in at night. It just gives us opportunity to keep a better eye on the calving cows. We've actually installed some lights that are light sensitive, so they come on as the daylight drops, and so the cameras work a bit better. So that's helped this year. That's a little bit of an improvement that wasn't very expensive to do either.
Just again, if you were having the access in and out of the shed is obviously key to the way you run the shed. You then start wondering whether you could lose, or could you have your access in from the feed stands rather than from the back of the bedded yard, so that again every metre squared is available for bedding. Yes,
the difficulty with having access on the left hand side next to the big white rectangle is that that's a big concrete panel. We use the Manitou bucket to scrape with, or the telescopic bucket, and we aren't able to use the scraper tractor to scrape it round the yards. There's no access back. We have to load it up to take it away. So yeah, it would be possible with a few changes, I'm sure.
Which then leads really on to the final point about making the most of every square metre is the lack of separation between the bedded area and the feed stands. So the no sort of physical barrier, be it a concrete step or a sleeper on its side, so that and you can see very slightly from the image there that there is tending to be some encroachment of wet material onto the bedded area. So while on paper we've got more than enough square meters for the number of cows Tim wants per side, when you actually start looking at some of the limitations, I think it becomes quite clear why my calculated figure of 23 and your magic number of 19 to 20, your magic number is better, because actually not every square meter is available.
It's not all utilizable, definitely not. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And then on the same vein,
Ian, sorry, I just had a question in relating to the last slide, really, on why is the space required calculated by yield rather than live weight or another measure?
Well, it's basically that figure was taken as part of the intervention study for the mastitis control plan. So when we were looking at risk factors, yield and bedded area were one of the risk factors identified. And I think the other issue is obviously it's a figure that's possibly better known to many farmers than live weight, for example. Bear in mind, high yielding cows will eat more, they will urinate more, and they'll dung more. So I think there's probably a more accurate correlation with yield than physical size of the cow. It's more to do with what comes out of the back end.
All right, thank you.
So on the same vein, really, if we look at feeding space, the standard we're always looking for is a minimum, and the key word there being minimum, of 3/4 of a metre per cow of feed space. So again, working on the dimensions that we have at Tim's, that would be a maximum of 25 cows on each side, assuming that all feed fence is available. So bearing in mind that we never get more than 20 cows in there, we should we should be looking pretty good on feed face. So the access for feeding, that's for obviously for the cows to feed, so they're feeding on a hard stand, which is great. So we're not going to get any immediate loss of area around the feeding. It's obviously access for feeding in terms of the machine as well, so what you can and can't get in there mechanically wise, and then flexibility of the product. So again, often driven by access. The access then drives what we can and can't feed. And then the need to be able to take waste feed out and push up and clean out. I think Nathan's going to talk about really the importance of maximising the dry matter during this critical period of the lactation.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So, I mean, obviously, maximising dry matter is important throughout lactation, but particularly transition cows and for fresh cows, making sure these cows continue to eat and are eating as much as they should be eating is crucial. If a transition cow is not eating enough, she runs the risk of going into negative energy balance both before and then definitely once she starts milking. And if she's not eating enough, she's not going to be filling herself up enough, and she's unlikely to be eating enough once she starts milking. So kind of to set them off on a good start, they have to be eating adequately. And there's a lot of focus, people put a lot of attention into what they're feeding their dry cows, what they're feeding their transition cows, and what they're feeding their milking cows. And obviously that is very important, but often people will overlook, it's not just what they eat, but it's how it's presented and how much of it they're actually getting to eat. Because if you've got a perfect ration, but the cows are only eating half what they should be eating, it's not going to be doing the job that it should be. So presentation is key. And as Ian has already spoken about, kind of making sure the accessibility is really important. So maximizing barrier space. And so for our transition cows and our fresh cows, we're wanting at least 0.75, maybe even ideally a metre per animal. But yeah, at least 0.75 metres per animal. We want at least 10 centimetres of water drop space per animal. And then also kind of making sure that the food that they're being offered is palatable and remains that way. So food being put out freshly, I mean, on farm, cows are fed daily, and I would say for transition cows and fresh cows, that wants to be a minimum. Cows fed daily, if more frequently, then that's ideal. And also making sure that the food is kept interesting. So we're having plenty of push-up. We know that cows, like if a feed barrier is pushed up, even if you don't add more feed to it, the cows will come and eat more from it. So having good push-up is really important, and also push out. So that's how much waste food is removed. In general, people talk about wanting to have about 5% of what you feed the cows being left at the end when you scrape it out. But for transition cows and for fresh cows, we really want that to be more like 10%, because we don't want these cows ever having no food in front of them. So making sure there's plenty of food there is key, really. And then kind of on the back of that, and maximizing our dry matter intake and using that to try and drive low levels of cow disease in and around calving. If we find that we are having periparturient disease that is kind of showing well above target, rather than saying at the end of the calving period, oh, well, we had a lot of cases of whites this year, by which point all that damage is done and we can't do anything about it. If we start seeing animals going over targets, then we want to be looking at cows, looking at body condition scores. Are they changing? In which way are they changing? And how and why might that be happening? And also considering taking bloods to look at things that kind of may give us an idea about where we want to be focusing our attention.
The one thing we have tried in the past, Emily, is manipulating the amount of feed they have at night, feeding them slightly more to see whether we can encourage them to calve during daylight hours. Hasn't really worked for us. I know it works for some fantastically well, but yeah, we still get cows calving at random times. We do record all the times they calve out, which is quite interesting. We ought to go through and analyze that to see whether we can change it at all.
I suppose one other thing just to add is that also when we talk about the fact that the cows are going into the calving, like the close to calving shed, and the particularly in pinch points, they may be going in sort of with less time and than we'd like them to, but at least before they go in there, they're on the same feed and the same type of feed and the same sort of spacing of feed that they're going to have at that area. So we're trying to minimize the impacts of change as much as possible.
Yeah, good point. Just want to highlight, just saying please do send in any questions, whether they're for Tim, Ian or Nathan. We'll cover them throughout. Anything else you want to add on that, Tim?
No, I think we've covered that. It is a great team effort to try and make sure we're carving them in the right space at the right time, and spotting any problems, such as twins as well, marking up any that have had calving issues in the past, marking up any cows that perhaps are a little bit oversensitive at calving time, and yeah, any that are at lower body condition score prior to drying off, we'll separate those out. It's not the ideal time to be getting weight on them, as Nathan often tells me. We ought to have done it months before, but we'll try and separate them, because we know that smaller cows, lighter weight, will have more chance of getting problems down the track if we don't keep them well fed, and they will struggle more on the self-feed system if they're very much more timid and lighter weight than others.
Great, thanks. Let you carry on, Ian.
Yeah, well, I just want to know, really touch on ventilation, because with any building designed to house dairy cattle, any stage of the lactation, ventilation is critical. It becomes even more important when we've got cows bedded on straw yards, purely because of the breaking down effect of the straw, and the dung generates heat. So the heat then can be greatly assisting ventilation, but it can also produce problems in terms of much higher relative humidity and dampness. So I think it's always really helpful to just go back to very basics and remember that the vast majority of buildings ventilate because of the stack effect. And fundamentally, the stack effect works because the heat that's generated from the straw yard, from the bedding pack, or from the cattle themselves rises. And as the heat rises, it rises to the top of the building, where it exits through the ridge. And as it exits from the ridge, it effectively creates a pressure difference, which draws fresh air in from outside. So we have this constantly changing airspace, with hot, stale air being vented through the ridge and fresh air being drawn in at the sides. So it's a very, very basic principle of the stack effect. So when we then start looking in a bit more detail at the ventilation requirements, for the stack effect to work, we need air to be venting out of the top of the ridge, but we also need sufficient area for the fresh air to be drawn in through the inlet. And as a rough rule of thumb, if you look at the outlet ventilation requirements, for an adult cow, we're looking about half a square metre per cow. So if we go back to Tim's building, we're talking about stocking at a maximum of 40 cows, 20 cows on each side. Then we need 20 square metres of outlet area. The building's 32 metres long. So in that situation, to hit our 20 square metres, we're looking for just over 600 mil, 60 centimetres wide outlet running the whole length of the building. Now we'll come back to that in a moment, because that's quite a significant hole running the whole length of the building. So then when you consider the inlet air admission, we're looking for that to be at least twice the size of the outlet. So when you work on the stocking rates that we have at Tim's farm, we're looking at about 20 square metres of open area on each side. Now, how that's achieved, whether that's with panels missing, whether that's space boarding, whether that's alternate boards removed, we still need 20 square metres per side. Now, bear in mind with space boarding, when you space board a shed, you only actually have 25% inlet area. 75% of a space boarded building is the boarding. So actually it can be quite difficult to get the amount of inlet that we're requiring. We can think about forced or mechanical ventilation, but we'll touch on that in a moment. Often it's a sticking plaster to solve a fundamental problem with natural ventilation. So we'd always try to sort natural ventilation before we go down the mechanical ventilation route. So how well does a shed ventilate? It's always useful to be able to evaluate that. And the critical thing to remember when you actually assess ventilation is you've got to do it with cows in the shed. So there's no point in testing the airflows in the shed with no cows, because you won't get the stack effect generated. There's all sorts of ways you can generate smoke, from wheelbarrows with straw and diesel, to naked flames. All of those, when you're in a straw yard that's dry, can be quite exciting. I would always favour drain testers. So these are large chemical reactions you light. They produce heat, but they don't produce a flame. Considerably safer than a naked flame in diesel and straw. So drain testers are a great way. You can set them going. You can watch how the smoke dissipates and moves within the building. What you're looking for to happen is for the smoke within 60 or 80 seconds to vent through the ridge and the air become clear. So if you set drain testers off in a building and the smoke hangs, or very commonly rises and then falls again, we know we've got a fundamental problem with airflows. Cobwebs on the roof of a building.
We sometimes do the smoke test inadvertently, Ian, with a straw bale if there's one that goes through that's not quite as pleasant as others, and it dissipates reasonably well.
Okay, naked flames and straw, never a great mix, Tim. But I would also, when I go into a building, if I've got concerns about ventilation, I'd look at cobwebs on the roof, and I'd look at dust, just general dirt on the roof sheets, because when you've got fairly aggressive movement of air up the roof and through the ridge, generally the roofs will self-clean. The other clue can be condensation, particularly if you've got cubicle beds and you can see water dripping onto the beds. That's a sure sign we've got a problem with ventilation. But if you look at the lower picture here, the top part of above the wall, I'm assuming, Tim, was traditional spaceboarding, and you've taken out every other board?
As my daughter calls it, is Shropshire boarding rather than Yorkshire boarding, and we've taken out every other board to give us a little bit more airflow, but there's nowhere near 625 mil gap in the middle or 20 square meters of airflow in the outside, so that's a real weakness we've got to work on.
Yeah, so if you look at the next slide, if we're looking at inlet ventilation, then although spaceboarding is great because it stops the driving rain, it's only giving you 25% of available airflow. So actually, spaceboarding is not great for natural ventilation. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I'm looking for the inlet ventilation to be about 50% of the surface area of the side of a building. So that's quite a lot of air that we're requiring to get in. And when we start thinking about the actual positioning of a building and its immediate surroundings, we have to be really aware that anything surrounding a building can have a fairly disruptive effect on airflow, whether that's other buildings, grain silos, or even a fence line or a hedge line, or some trees. So if you take the height of some trees, for example, they can have a very disruptive effect on airflow patterns, somewhere between 5 and 10 times the height of the tree. So looking at getting airflows in is also about walking around the shed on the outside and seeing what potentially can be limiting the airflow coming in. But on the next slide, I think Tim has hit the nail on the head, really. I suspect the fundamental problem that you're facing is the fact that you have a cranked ridge on the shed. So the cranked ridge is the top left picture, very commonly fitted to the buildings that were put in generally as a general purpose building, wholly inadequate for housing dairy cattle. We just cannot get sufficient airflow out of those buildings. Now there are solutions, as always. There's solutions. Some can be quite expensive. You can take panels off. If you look at the bottom left picture, that's a protected open ridge, where the panels have been, actually the cranked panels have been removed and new panels fitted with a chimney effect. The top right picture, again, has been rather a homemade attempt at improving the outlet ventilation. So the ridge was removed, a slight A-frame was built, and then the ridge was refixed back, and that worked particularly well. And the bottom right is probably the cheapest and most simple, which is basically inserting pieces of wood underneath the cranked ridge to create a gap of about 100 mil to allow airflow to generate. The other thing which can be very successful, it is basically to have a cherry picker and cut holes in the crank themselves to allow the stale air to exit. Now that becomes quite problematic if it's an old roof, particularly if it's not fibre cement. If it's asbestos, it can be highly problematic, and it's certainly not something to do without the appropriate safety equipment or a cherry picker. But getting that stale air away is going to be critical to improving the environment within the building.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so
the left-hand side, Ian, as you spotted, has worse ventilation problems, slightly more cobwebs than the right-hand side where the heifers are with the blue boards. That has more of an open vent that takes the stale air out much easier.
And would you consider just cutting holes in the ridge?
It could be a possibility, yes. Yeah, no, that would be improving the ventilation, no, and the light. Some of the roof sheets, the skylights, for instance, could be changed at the same time to improve the ability to see what's going on in there, and some more natural light would be helpful.
Yeah, so the last slide on ventilation, really, which is just sort of summarising that the ridge is absolutely critical. So a protected open ridge, even holes cut into the cranks, anything to allow that stale air to ventilate and vent out the building, just to keep the stack effect going. And with the best will in the world, crown cranked ridges just are not really suitable for housing dairy cattle. The downside, of course, of cutting holes in the roof is that periodically you will get that very intense Shropshire rainstorm, and you will get rain come through the holes. And of course, we remember that intense rainstorm. We don't remember the other 99 out of 100 days when there wasn't an intense rainstorm and the ventilation worked really well. And I think the final point, there are mechanical solutions out there. There's positive tube ventilation, there's fans, there's all sorts of things that we can do to a shed to mitigate poor ventilation. My starting point would always be to try to optimize the natural ventilation. So do what we can to maximize the amount of inlet and the amount of outlet ventilation. If that doesn't work, because possibly the building's in the center of a farmyard surrounded by other buildings, then let's think about mechanical ventilation. But first off, we've got to be looking at natural ventilation. So then I just wanted to talk a little bit about when we're thinking about the management of the yard, and Tim, I'll ask for your penny's worth in here. When I look at anybody who's got close to calving and a calving yard, it's all about location. It needs to be somewhere that's highly visible, people are walking past it regularly, and it's not out of sight, out of mind. And I think your facility is about as good as it gets from that perspective, Tim.
Location is superb because it's on the way back for both our middle year Harper Adams student to poke their eyes across the calving yard, and we've got the addition of cameras, and everybody keeps a close eye on what's going on there. Yeah, it is a good location, certainly.
And how long have the cameras been fitted, Tim?
It goes back to my mother and sheep 30 years ago. We had camera systems, albeit a very ancient wires system. We haven't gone away from wires entirely, but the cameras have improved a huge amount in the fact that they now swivel and zoom, so we can keep an eye on them at and enables you not to disturb them as well, and you can watch them. A lot of farms have installed cameras recently, and it's paid for itself many times over with just catching one with either skin over the nose, or sometimes more importantly, a set of legs coming backwards, where you know you've got to intervene more urgently.
So then when we actually look at the management of the yard, Tim's sort of calving system as such is that the majority of the cows will actually calve in the main bedded area, and then, numbers permitting, they then head to one of the smaller pens. But we might also be having to consider a management system where we're using a snatch calving, or we may have all cows actually physically calving in individual pens. So depending on the requirements of the individual farm, there's sort of 3 main areas that we can have to plan for. Obviously, any system where we're handling cows at and around the point of calving needs to be easily handled, needs to be safe for the animal, and very importantly, particularly if you're doing work on your own, it needs to be safe for the staff. So we've all presumably had periods where we've been handling cattle late at night or in the middle of the night on your own, with facilities that are perhaps not ideal. So I think it's imperative that when we're actually looking at the layout of these facilities, that we look and consider ease of handling, stress-free. Tim mentioned stress-free right at the beginning, stress-free for the cow and stress-free for staff wherever possible, and making sure that we've got correct facilities. So we've got gates, we've got pens, we've got gates that are correct length, and we can actually handle these cattle safely and stress with minimum stress as often as possible.
I think that also, yeah, so I think that also comes down to the animal behaviour and how they're handled throughout the farming calendar year as well. TB is a stressful time testing, but we try and minimise that as much as possible, and using aconite and things like that to reduce stress, and the whole management and giving cows time to do their own thing and not be forced unnecessarily. So yeah, it's being as kind to them, because then you know that they're not going to sort of put up resistance at the crucial time around calving.
Yeah, Tim, I just wondered if you'd touch on moving cows from the dry cow housing to close to calving, because I know you said you're moving them in groups, and why you're doing that and how that helps.
Yeah, Sean and Lewis and Taylor will go through the calving, close-up calving ones that are away from the calving yard, mark those up, and we'll WhatsApp the numbers through to each other, know which ones need to be moved into the calving yard. We'll check their calving dates, so they haven't been dried off sort of a week before as well, which can be confusing as well if there's any late dry off cows in amongst them. But we'll make sure that the close to calving ones go into the backyard calving area, and we'll move out heifers and keep a stable number of heifers in the right hand side as well. So there's always cows moving, and if there's some that have been moved into there that haven't bagged up, and it is very often done on calving dates or actual physical signs, the udder looks closer to calving, then we'll move them in there. We won't tend to move them in and move them back out regularly. Once they're in, we'll stabilize the group. Doing it early in the morning seems to help. After morning milking, when they're being fed, works well. And
you said try 4 or 5 at a time if you can, just so they're not one.
try and avoid, if we possibly can, moving one at a time. If for any instance one starts to calve in the larger main group away from there, we'll move her directly into an individual calving pen. Generally takes an hour longer to calve than we find, but we'll put the camera on that one calving and make sure that that one behaves properly and calves down normally if she started to calve well before her calving date. Sometimes you get beaten by them holding to a previous service, which challenges us, but yeah, we'll try and avoid them calving in there. Not to say that it's not a perfect world, they don't all calve in the right place, but the majority do.
Thanks. And just we've had a couple of questions on calving in cubicles, so just we are coming to that as well.
So as we said, we've got the sort of three main calving systems as such, which obviously the snatch calving in individual pens, and then calving in the main bedded area. And obviously Tim is following the latter, with most of the cows actually calving in the main straw area. Now this is where you have to be very careful. You could be very tempted to get on your high horse and say this is dreadful and you mustn't calve cows in a yard because of the risk of cross suckling and mastitis spread, etc., etc. I think it's very important when you actually start looking at making changes on in a calving area that you actually look at particularly mastitis patterns. And if we have a farm that is running calving cows on a straw yard, but actually their incidence of clinical mastitis within the first 30 days, so in other words likely to be associated with the dry period, is very low, as Tim's is, then the system is working. And I think it's really important that when we look at making changes, we don't change for change's sake if it's an area that is working and working quite successfully. So I think when you're calving in the main yard, the critical thing is obviously hygiene and cleanliness, and the frequency of cleaning the beds out. And Tim, how often are you managing to get the beds cleaned out during the calving season?
So we'll clean the calving yard out twice during the calving season, and then we'll take the pressure off it. Now this time of the year they're out days, and if there's any that are due to calve, we'll keep those in at night, but generally they're kept out fully at the moment and brought in to calve overnight if needs be. But twice over the calving period from February we'll clean the yards out and disinfect, and we're also using Pruex bacteria onto the straw yards as well to try and improve the dominant good bacteria as well. That's something we're trialing this year. The jury's still out, but I think we've had a good run at it, and it is something we're finding it's keeping the water cleaner as well, which water is such a critical issue as well.
Yes, obviously cow cleanliness and cow comfort is critical to what you're trying to achieve, Tim. So you're cleaning the beds out regularly. You're not scared to put a lot of straw in there every day, and it's managing a busy yard, isn't it? That's the critical thing.
Yes, it's certainly expensive on straw, but the cow comfort, the ease of management thereafter, the avoidance of mastitis in the early lactation, as you've detailed, is critical, because then it makes the whole process more smooth thereafter.
But as we said, when we've got the two sides of the yard, we've got cows and heifers, and one of the main reasons we do that is for management of yonies. So on the next slide, I think Nathan, can you just run through your take on segregation of the yonies cows?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tim and his team at the farm have been we've been working together for the last sort of 7 or 8 years managing yonies. So there's a lot of things that have been been put in place over that time. They're currently running at less than 1% red cows. From a segregation, obviously, because talking about the calving period, the cows at the farm are separated. So red and yellow cows are separated from green cows at drying off, and that gives them the maximum amount of time for them to be separated, so that when the green cows come to calve, we're minimising the chance of contamination of green cows with muck from red and yellow cows, and that getting onto their calves. Because we know that the biggest impactor on whether a calf becomes a Johne's cow later in its life, because most calves who get Johne's catch it within the first month of life, the biggest impactor is the status of their mother when they were born. And so if we can keep those red and yellow cows away, and so the red and yellow cows, if there are any, they are separated out at drying off, and they are housed separately until they re-enter the milking herd. So they don't go anywhere near the green dry cow shed or the green calving shed or anything like that. There's complete separation of kit, and personnel deal with the clean jobs with the green cows first, and then they go to the red and yellow cows after. Red cows aren't served again because we're trying to reduce the number of red cows that there are. If there are any, yellow cows are served, but they're only served to beef, but they tend to be served towards the tail end of the block, so that those calves are being born and those cows are calving towards the tail end of the block, where we've got less cows being calved, and we also don't have the heifer replacements being born. So again, we're trying to, I mean, a block calving system is almost the ideal system for trying to manage Johne's. You can manage it well in all year round, but the cyclic nature of the block calving system does really help with that. But trying to keep that, I mean, that segregation is so important to try and protect the future generations of heifer replacements coming through. And it may mean that in some instances, the red and yellow cows who are calving, their calves don't, they may not transition quite as well, because we may have one shed that's got all of them in. They may all be managed as one group, but we're trying to maximize maximize the benefit to the remainder of the herd. So it's not the 1 or 2%, we're looking at the 97, 98, 99% of the herd that we're trying to protect. And kind of as a one final point, looking at the bottom, talking about care with heifers. Obviously heifers, they're an unknown quantity. They, in general, testing heifers before they calve, the results are not particularly useful. If they're negative, that doesn't mean that they necessarily will be negative forever. And so trying to make sure that we're keeping those, treating those heifer cows, those heifers calving down with some degree of caution. So some herds will feed heifer colostrum to their calves, others will take colostrum from cows that we know have a long-term history of being negative, and we use that instead.
Very good overview. The positive thing that we've got through, Nathan, is we've got down to currently no reds and yellows in the herd, which is fantastic. And any heifers that calve that stay within the calve colostrum group for one reason or the other, perhaps they've had a slightly tougher calving, their milk will be segregated out and fed directly to beef calves, not to replacement calves, because we're not sure of their status. 5th of May next week, we're doing a full Johne's test through milk recording, so we'll have some up-to-date results on the whole of the herd that can be determining which ones we serve to replacement rather than serve to beef. So yeah, it's something that we've worked long and hard at with Nathan, and yeah, very pleased to be improving. It's one of those long wins, isn't it, I think, Nathan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Both.
Yeah, so I just want to know, go back really to a point I was making earlier, that when we start thinking about mastitis and levels of mastitis infection, it's critical to understand where the infection's originating so that we can then address it. Now, in Tim's situation, if you looked at the very first slide that Nathan shared with us, Tim's running at about 30% of the maximum target level for cases of mastitis within the first 30 days. So in other words, the system, the way that Tim is running the system, is not creating problems with dry period infections. We're not getting mastitis picked up at and around drying off, at and around calving. So the system is working well. If we were faced with a different picture and we were finding that you were above target levels with case of mastitis in the first 30 days, at that point we might want to start thinking about individual calving pens. So almost starting to work on the sort of foot out principle. So when you see the feet out, which is where your super duper cameras could come in, Tim, when you actually see a cow starting to calve, she's separated, she's taken out into the individual calving pens. So these are very much transition short-term accommodation. Everybody worries, and rightly so, about cow comfort and cow grip when they move into these yards. So if you have a deep rubber mat, that gives both comfort, warmth and grip for the cow when she's at and around calving. The beauty of these types of facilities is that you can clean them out between individual calvings. You can periodically disinfect them. So they are a really useful tool to be able to reduce infections at and around the dry period. Of course, the challenge becomes the number of pens. And if you have a very tight block calving herd, if you take Tim's as an example, up to 15 cows a day calving at peak times, and the need and the wish to keep cows and calves together for 24 hours. So in your situation, Tim, it would be a lot of short-term accommodation pens. And the next slide. If people go down the investigation route, this is some work that was done by Bradley and Green and was really formed part of the advice that made up the mastitis control plan. If you look at the period of risk for environmental infections during the year, it's at and around drying off, at and around calving, and once a cow calves in and calves in clean, then the risk falls through the rest of lactation. So the really critical periods that we want to worry about are the point that we dry her off, and this couple of weeks pre-calving and immediately at calving. And this is very much in line with Nathan's comment about the immune system being suppressed at and around calving. So if we have the data suggests we have a problem with dry period infections, then we might want to think about the individual pens. They don't
Ian,
want to.
Do you just want to mention the tools available for people to look at their mastitis patterns?
Yeah. So actually, if we can skip back to the previous graph, because it's interesting, and it's obviously the way that the graph is showing on the PowerPoint as opposed to what it's supposed to look like. The two peaks somehow or other have slipped downhill and moved left. So the peak at drying off should be a peak at drying off, and the peak at calving should be a peak at calving. So it's fine on my screen, but I don't quite know what's happened there.
I wondered.
Yeah, sorry.
I wondered why it was the cow's nose, or cow's middle of the forehead.
Yeah, somehow or other, something's happened in transmission. Never mind. But yeah, so in terms of identifying where we need to focus effort, we need to be able to understand where the mastitis is originating from. So the two ways to do that is there is the full-blown AHDB mastitis control plan, which is combining data analysis and mastitis patterns with a very comprehensive questionnaire to identify where to focus your attention. 12 months ago, though, there is a further development, which is the Quarter Pro initiative, which is, for want of a better word, a streamlined full mastitis control plan. So by taking milk recording data, converting it and feeding it into the Quarter Pro pattern analysis tool, it will actually allow us to see very simply and very easily where the problem is originating from. So it will tell us if we have a problem that's environmental in nature, it will tell us if there's a problem in contagious mastitis, and it will tell us whether it's lactation or dry period originating. Now, once you've looked at the pattern analysis tool, there are then on the AHDB website a range of resources specifically for environmental mastitis, contagious mastitis, dry period infections and lactation management. But like all of these things, it's knowing where to start looking so that you don't waste time and effort chasing up blind alleys that are not relevant.
Thanks, Ian. I've just noticed the time as well. So, and we've had a question on how deep should the matting be in an individual pen?
Yeah, so the sort of bog standard mat that you get in on a cubicle bed would be about 40 millimeters thick, 35 to 40 mils thick. If you're putting it on a cubicle, I personally prefer 60 mil rubber mats that you can get in horse stables. So they're a little bit more expensive, but they're much thicker and much more forgiving. So I would be suggesting 60 mil.
Oh, thank you.
So if we just quickly skip then, so if we go back to, if we identify that there is a need for an individual pen, then making sure it's not very big, so no more than 12 foot by 12 foot. So it's actually, you've got a fair chance of being able to control and manage the cow within the pen. Having a yoke to be able to hold her and restrain her, particularly if you're working on your own. And then actually, if you believe that you may have periodically a problem with occasional cows in the yard, having a power supply to be able to run a mobile milker or a vacuum line to run an individual milking point just gives you a little bit more flexibility. Alternatives to straw for the yard: sand can be very popular. Sawdust yards can be very popular. I think we have to be realistic enough and say that they are incredibly labor intensive, and you would need to be removing dung at least 3 times a day, because obviously a sawdust or a straw yard, a sand yard, can become very soiled very, very quickly. The plus side of having cows calving on sand is it can significantly reduce the risk of new environmental infections. And then the final point, somebody mentioned this as a question, Emily, it is dry cows in cubicles.
Yeah, I'll just read the question out as well. We have cubicles for our cow housing. Can we have suggestions on how we can adapt housing for the calving period? Calving in cubicles is not ideal, but we don't have much alternative space for any significant amount of loose yard.
So I suppose it comes back down to numbers again, doesn't it? It's how many cows are we likely to have calving at any one time? So I think the questioner is absolutely right. Having calving cows in cubicles and actually physically expecting them to calve in a cubicle, I think is difficult to justify. Will and can be very, very problematic. You obviously can't have automatic scrapers if you have calving cows in cubicles, and the bed management is critical, but I think the question is absolutely right. You do require a calving area, so somewhere that you can take cows at the point of calving and calve them in a yard. And if you look at the bottom picture there, there's sand bedded cubicles that are sand bedded cubicles for dry cows, but the cows are taken out at the point of calving onto a rubber mat. Now, hygiene is critically important, and some bedded areas or some yard areas are better than others. So I think if I was trying to give some advice to answer the question, in my mind, I have no problem with dry cows in cubicles, assuming that they are adequately sized for a pregnant cow. But you're absolutely right, you do need to have an area somewhere where you can walk them quietly and calve them separately.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not sure what the flicking there was.
So that's me done. Tim, anything
yeah.
anything to add?
No, I think one thing we have learnt, you mentioned calving yokes and gates, and we've got a short calving gate that we installed a few years ago, which has a extended chain on the side of things, and last year we put a slightly longer gate on, and the longer gate works better. We've got slightly more ability to get a cow in when you're alone working on your own, safer, or you have to come up with little skills of getting the cow to put her head in to enable you to safely milk her. The majority will stand still with fresh feed. You can put the milking unit on, take some colostrum off them, feed the calf, everything is hunky-dory, but there's some that need extra holding, and a yoke system that's secure is crucial in that. And we probably do require one more yoke and gate system to make it more flexible, really.
Okay, thank you. So I
think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, no, we absolutely haven't. There was just one question on what you were using to bolus your cows, Tim.
Those would be calcium bovicalc boluses at point of calving, 2 boluses that any cow over 5th lactation will get a bolus, just because they're ones more at risk of, historically in the past we've learned, more at risk of having mastitis as they come round, drop in immunity. Even though they're the ones that suit our system well, if they've had plenty of calves. It's something that Nathan and I discussed and has worked incredibly well.
Right, thank you. Oh, and then a little bit of a curveball, I guess. Any thoughts on calving at pasture? Autumn calving generally has ideal ground conditions for this. Challenge can be feeding a dry cow ration.
And also challenge can be finding the calf as well in a big autumn calved outdoor. So some of us will calve outside this time of the year, and we'll be moving them, break fencing them across grazed pasture. Love to have a little bit more grazed pasture in the diet at the moment, so we'll be shortly going out to do a rain dance to encourage a bit more to fall, well, any to fall from the sky. I've forgotten where my weather gear is, but hopefully it won't just settle into a rain pattern now. So yeah, autumn calved cows, try not to give them too much grass, longer fibre as well, and balancing that with straw and minerals would be my take on it, but probably want more expert opinion.
Any comment from Ian on that?
When the weather is set fair, calving at pasture can be fantastic, relatively low environmental risk, until the calving paddock is the calving paddock that is selected because it's the one at the back of the house. So we've clearly identified in Tim's facility, it's all about location. So your shed works well because people regularly go past it. If you have a calving paddock that is near the house so that everybody sees it regularly, it can become highly problematic. So calving outside when the weather is clement is fine, but we need to keep changing the paddock. And I would be suggesting you'd be wanting to move cows about every 14 days so that they're onto fresh grass, and give the previous paddock a chance to recover. But of course that then becomes very problematic in terms of managing the grass growths in those areas, because we don't want them in lush fresh grass.
Yeah, couple probably more conversation for another day. Yeah, so I think we've probably just run out of time now, but thank you very much to Ian, Nathan and Tim. Just want to highlight, really, we've got a couple of really good resources, the in-calf guide for both block and all year round herds. And this, hopefully you might be able to see a couple of the titles on the contents page, but there's a good section on post-calving management, going through a lot of what we've spoken about today. And then along with that, there's a transition wall chart, probably more focused to your all year round herds, but really that there's stickers that come with it. You can see the key on the left hand side, looking at the transition disorders, and you can have targets for your farm, and then you'll be able to see when you've gone over that and need some management changes. So these are available to have a hard copy, so you can contact your local knowledge exchange manager. And yeah, finally, just the KPI Express tool. So we've got, you can look at all your key performance indicators specific to your farming system and compare them. So all our strategic farms have got their KPIs online, so you can go and compare them, yours with theirs. This is the cows and heifers calved in the first 6 weeks, something that related to today. And lastly, we are recruiting for more strategic dairy farms in the red circles, if you can see those on the map. So if you are interested or just want some more information, then give that email kedaryadmin@ahdb.org.uk or your local KE manager. Cool. So just thank you very much and have a good afternoon, and thanks again to Tim, Ian and Nathan.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
See you on farm soon.
Hopefully, yes.